So next we have Katelynn Carver, and we have an audio file from her. Katelynn is up in St Andrews University. We've had problems with the internet. She's managed to find a spot where she can upload the files. It's just an audio file, and so I'll play that for you, and then we're going to get her on Skype after we play that.
Hello, my name is Katelynn Carver, and I just first want to thank everyone for being so flexible and for understanding that I couldn't be there in person today to join you, which I very much wanted to be there in person to participate and to hear all of your lovely presentations as well. Unfortunately, I am still recovering from a fairly major foot injury and the ensuing surgery that followed. And so travel is a little bit up in the air for me right now. So I'll be presenting from a distance, but know that I am very regretful that I cannot be there in person. The idea of the apocalypse has been near-ubiquitously skewed into an incontrovertible synonym for the end times, despite the more literal translation of the word itself leaning closer toward an uncovering or a disclosure of knowledge. A knowing that arises from the hidden or that emerges from beyond the veil that is largely usurped by conceptualizations in the book of Revelation regarding the very literal end of the physical world. For this particular presentation, I am focusing on representations of apocalypse provided by post-secular theopoetics and process theologians, specifically the work done by Catherine Keller that has placed the issue of gender as it regards apocalypse in the spotlight, reframing the dominance of patriarchal institutions and mores in terms of what apocalypse means, violent, war-torn, imperialistic end, and exploring the feminine creativity that can be evoked from the traditionally oppressive idea of unveiling. The wedded virgin here transforms into the maternal waters, the chaotic sea, the space in which novel creativity takes form and pushes humanity forward. However, in part because our society today has far too prevalent a tendency to colloquially associate feminism and feministic ideals with the outright and total rejection of the masculine, I am instead to swap the terminology for a functionally synonymous idea of balance and lack of dominion, an agendered approach, perhaps in itself the apocalyptic unveiling of new knowledge in our time, aimed toward the character of creative novelty rather than an obsessive preoccupation with the gender of what it means to know or unveil, to transform or invent. Traditionally, yes, these themes have been associated with the feminine, but I would seek to challenge this established norm as a distraction in many circles of conversation, specifically those that are outside of academia, from the larger understanding of the eschaton as what Keller herself alternatively translates not as end, but instead as edge, a chaosmos where possibility reigns and novelty is unavoidable as new knowledge emerges ad infinitum. And if we are at the edge rather than the end, it is our task to take the potential that awaits there and have courage to make it known in a way that uncovers the novelty presented and apply it fruitfully to transform the reality we know into a new revelation, an apocalypse that sees beyond binaries and domination of one thing superseding another, and instead ushers us, academically and practically, toward an even more inclusive and progressive means of understanding our world and our place within it, both now and in whatever future apocalypses await. Here, I want to take a quick moment before diving into the meat of the presentation to make clear that I don't seek to emphasize the anti-feministic or to place into question the inarguable and immense contributions of feminism and gender studies to a whole host of fields, not least of which is theology and apocalyptic studies. But instead, I aim to underscore and suggest something that likely better finds identification as the post-feministic, though as a society we are nowhere near there, much in the way that Keller says even her subtitled Feminist Field Guide to the End of the World melted its boundaries and blurred its gender. Perhaps less like the established field of post-feminism or fourth wave feminism, and more literal in the sense of taking what fourth wave feminism presents and flattening it out, for lack of a better image, not for the sake of superficiality or with the intent of oversimplifying its complex diversity, but instead with the aim of making it more accessible and applicable at large, and specifically within our context here. Moreover, when I speak of the move beyond traditional understandings of difference, specifically in gender and the traits and conceptualizations of self and context and action associated therein, I am not by any means speaking to the demeaning and prejudicial simplification of such movements or counter-movements as the understanding of common oppression or all lives matter. I'm instead speaking to an interrelated sense of being that cannot exist optimally and cannot thrive, perhaps at all, without a co-relational, interconnected sense of entanglement. Novelty, and thereby progress, can only come from the many interacting, co-supporting, reinforcing, and transforming to become momentary, singular actualities of selves, of communities, of modes of being that act within the temporal world and between interconnected beings within that world. Frances Willard spoke to the synonymous coming of the millennium and the coming of women into all aspects of society as equals. And this is, arguably, a very fourth wave feminist concept. And it is unfortunately, particularly in my context in the United States, overlooked as a result of misogynistic understandings of feminism as misandry. As such, I aim to bypass that. Not merely to co-opt the work of feminism and rebrand it, but instead to see its fruits and integrate them meaningfully within a process-relational post-gender understanding of human coexistence, mirroring the synergistic co-creativity of the alpha and the omega, focusing primarily on the differentiation rather than the integration, which is where I'd like to place my focus here. Right, then, starting from the first, from Jezebel to the whore of Babylon to the raping of the figurative prostitute of Rome, it's no secret that women are not addressed in the book of Revelation with particular warmth or respect. I take this knowledge largely as a given for our current purposes, and in taking this long-standing framework through to the modern day and speaking specifically again to my personal frame of reference for exemplification, in the United States, the steady and recent widespread of fundamentalism, loud if not wholly representative, though these voices are, has been steadily underscoring the question of apocalypse as end, and has thus played a significant role in ushering the concern of these end times to the fore in theological and colloquial conversation. From the traditionally masculine and undoubtedly, arguably misogynistic images and ideals in Revelation, these fundamentalist voices have attempted in many spaces to rise and speak to what sociologist James Aho terms not as a hatred of the feminine, but instead of the feminine principle, which indeed may be expressed theoretically, but is in fact practiced contrarily, as Brenda Brasher indicates that fundamentalist apocalypticism actually attempts to emphasize the traditional feminist ideal, which perhaps above all else eschews the idea of women in positions of leadership and power, so as to conveniently leave these positions open exclusively to men. While historically, atypicalities have emerged and have been tolerated sometimes or perhaps largely under the guise of the transcendent urgency of imminent apocalypse, this is simply a woefully condensed summary of where the apocalyptic has been seated and how it has been allowed to shape a traditionally masculine world state, imperialistic, militaristic, and driven by the bottom line of power, sometimes simply without the input or participation of women, and other times at their direct expense. With the rise of feminist philosophy and theory, and along with it feminist theology, however, new conceptualizations of apocalypse, indeed of counter-apocalypse, began to emerge, and feminine imagery of creation rather than destruction saw light shone upon it. While she is by no means the first or only feminist theologian speaking on the matter, or analogous concepts, from the primal feminine waters, Catherine Keller observes a cosmic matricide in which Tiamat, horror of Babylon, goddess of the primordial chaos, is rendered John's whore, and Tehom is feared, the unknown potential preferred over the certainty of war, of bloodshed, of swords from the heavens, any light as preferable to the shadows, even if it is destructive light, fire. From this, Keller in turn provides one of the most poetic interpretations of what the feminine waters, the primordial chaosmos, emerges to contain, with an interrelational, process-oriented model of creativity that emerges from initial chaos, that is creation, the tohu vabohu of Genesis, and serves as an inception point, the origin and the beginning that is reimagined endlessly within existence, throughout the entire universe and across time, emphasizing and encompassing the persistent possibility for newness, the process-relational ideal within Alfred North Whitehead's metaphysics. Citing chaos theory, which is fitting given Whitehead's history as a mathematician, Keller identifies fluctuation as being the cosmic oscillation that gives birth to chaos, which in turn gives rise to alternative modes of order within systems of chaos themselves, new possibilities, new entities, and thus new contrasts arising from the fray. The primal feminine chaos from whence all things come is then rendered a breeding ground for boundless potential, the original intensity of the universe that can disintegrate into meaninglessness or give rise to novel contrasts through new forms of organization, order, and significance within human experience. It is where the activity of the universe originates, the differentiation of all things that allows for the contrasts that invite novel complexities and engender the intensity that leads vibrancy to human existence. It is out of chaos that contrast arises, that creation takes place, and novelty is realized. The debris of that which is destroyed is the matter we recycle anew, at the chaotic heart of all reality. And here we begin to see what I will go on shortly to emphasize as the egalitarian, agendered apocalypse. For where the debris of militaristic messianism falls, the chaosmos, the primal waters, collect the dust to make them new. The edge of newness, or else end of the world that we know in light of novel revelation and transformation, rather than the end of all things. This primal chaos is not then only terror and darkness, not merely unbounded, raucous, and intelligible energy. Instead, it is also a conduit for potential, contrast, and the promise of creative possibility. The beauty of chaos guarantees in perpetuation that contrast, the endurance of relationship, and the eventuality of intensity. It ensures that whatever experiences are engaged in human life, they are not infinite, they are not unidimensional, and they will be countered, balanced, and synthesized harmoniously in the overall experience of existence via persistent contrast. Only through this primordial chaos is there differentiation and contrast itself. Only through such chaos can there be relationship between contrasts that, in coming together, not only create something novel, but something of greater meaning, depth, and significance. Thus, purely feminine, purely masculine, or even equality, when it is static, is not a fruitful state of being at the end, beginning, or anywhere in between, within one revelation or another. Moreover, experience is not infinite or unchanging in the process relational understanding, thus bolstering the idea of apocalypse as unveiling of novelty, of eschaton as edge of newness, and end that heralds new beginning and new growth, new experience and contrast that stretches again beyond simple binaries of thought. The self exists within connection as a function of necessity, lest it become meaningless in stagnation. What Keller eloquently states as the sham of separateness, yielding to the vibrancy of an entangled indeterminacy. That indeterminacy of our very existence is emergent over and over again as the mysterious nebulous rule rather than an idealized fanciful exception. Agendered, again, then, not in the sense of eschewing or denying the significance of gender or what insight it provides, but instead agendered in that gender is not the prime concern. Difference is merely the nascent state, necessary but incomplete and far from fully realized, before contrasts of every shape and sort are interwoven to create newness, to invite progress, to make apocalypse at the eschaton of our own will, and to shape it with all that we bring to this plane of being. This creative space of liminality, I think, is perhaps the most androgynous of all, in that it embraces absolute uncertainty, pure, unadulterated potential as the focus, the emphasis, And the power is shifted and shared across boundaries and binaries, occupying multiple position or no position at all, and vacillating wildly between possibilities. This is perfect creativity. This is what is held in the waters. This is chaos most realized. And in this space, the masculine and feminine do battle as much as they make peace. They play off of one another to find a balance that is both satisfying and stable enough to stand. And at this interrelational edge, where change is constant and our future uncertain, it is our task to step into the waters that await there, the depths that sing there, the potential that swirls there, without fear of shadow or violence against the unknown. No, we must do the exact opposite. We must have the courage to make it known. And then from there, we must have the vision and the fortitude to make it known in a way that shines, that takes the novelty given and uses it, applies it, to transform the reality we know into something that perhaps we could have only imagined if we let our imaginations run wild. A world with fewer boundaries, and where possibility and innovation, progress and transformation toward the good is the norm. And these principles are transcendent of gender. They encompass and overwhelm that singular distinction. Heterogeneity is not, after all, a simple split between two, but a diverse amalgam that contains many. And within a world that is more than gender binaries and their classical affiliations, feminist and masculine understandings of the apocalypse have largely run their course, in need of being replaced by the post-feminist, post-gendered, and or agendered approach I have briefly proposed, immersed in Whitehead's process thought and Keller's expansions in that vein, that do not prioritize a question of gender that is becoming more a point of contention and or irrelevance, to the point that its capacity for novel contribution and creation of progress is being limited. And as Keller declares, those committed to a hopeful planetary future will have to confront the living sources of apocalyptic hope. And I believe that hope is to be found beyond the binaries, beyond the boundaries, in the intermingling, in the indefinable, in the liminal agendered androgyny that is the feminine depths and the masculine power play at work together in constant dynamic interweaving so as never to create the same thing, nor themselves twice. There, then, beyond stagnation, trivialization, and the petty differences that only deepen the divides, there, perhaps, is where apocalypse will offer us the revelation of hope that, as a species, we so desperately long for. Thank you.
I got something here. Sometimes. I'll ask a question.
Hello, Katelynn.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
So everybody has just enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you so much for appreciate it. And thank you all for listening.
So we'll, if you will, have a quick question and answer session.
Absolutely.
Any questions for Katelynn? Yes.
Thank you. A very interesting paper. I just recently read a paper by Mary Wilson Carpenter, and in there she talks about the possibility of a feminist apocalypse, and then rejects the idea later on and says, because Revelation is unable to dispense with violence, and because it's at the core a gendered violence, what would be at stake to sort of create a feminist apocalypse would be the vision of apocalyptic power itself. And I'm wondering if you have a comment on that, and if feminist apocalypse is possible.
Honestly, I mean, admittedly, apocalypse is not my particular area of focus. I'm familiar with it. I've worked with it. So I don't speak with the kind of authority as someone who does this as their particular area of academic focus. But in my opinion, I don't think it is. I think that she has a very good point that without being able to dispense with violence, it is difficult to take the way that the Apocalypse of John is actually written and the imagery that it uses as something that is reconcilable with what we understand as fourth wave and beyond feminism. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess a follow-up question would be then, I mean, we have so many social theorists now using the language of apocalypse, quite consciously religious. I'm thinking of Slavoj Žižek, for example, or Rancière, these sorts of individuals. And I'm wondering, can there be a secularized apocalypse then? Can feminism seize on that part of it? Because it seems to be quite useful maybe in speaking about things like climate change and other things like that, where it really emphasizes, sometimes through metaphor, the seriousness of the sort of present situation. And I'm wondering if at least the language could be seized upon by feminism.
I think definitely. I think particularly in the academy, we have this fear of co-opting other areas, a fear really of interdisciplinarity, that we're stepping on someone's toes or that we're not giving one area of focus or one departmental kind of sect the due that it deserves because maybe we're not credentialed in that particular aspect or we're not, as much of an expert as someone else. And I think that in particularly in occasions such as this, we limit what we're able to do with the ideas, and we limit where they can go and what they can do and how they can affect the actual application of these thoughts and these concepts, because they do have a lot of worth and they do have a lot of relevance. But if we continue to only put them in the places where they've always been and keep kind of talking in circles in the same groupings in the same communities, where we are kind of cutting the momentum off at the head. And I think that it can really do good work in secularized contexts, particularly, as you said, with climate change. I mean, I'm a process theologian, so a lot of that rhetoric comes in for process theology when it's thinking about climate change, when it's thinking about, what is the human versus the spiritual or the interconnected of the two role in climate change and also the response to climate change. So yes, I do think that the language is very useful for secular contexts.
Thank you.
Yes, question over there.
Yeah, I do. Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if you feel there's an irony or an agitation within fundamentalism. The body of Christ is a bride, and that I would think there would be much agitation with the acceptance of that concept by many who would be men. But even then, the whole meta narrative of the eschaton moving toward, in Revelation, a very positive aspect of the bride as the bride and the bridegroom, the wedding supper of the Lamb. So it seems like the movement in at least Christian eschatology would be toward the feminine gender instead of a neutral. Do you see that?
Yeah, I do see that, and admittedly, I'm more inclined to view most of the imagery and most of the rhetoric in a very metaphorical sense. So for me, while it is written and depicted as a shift toward the feminine, I personally am more inclined to see it more as a shift toward egalitarianism, toward celebration, toward, I think I used the term goodness in the presentation, as generic a word as that is. But I think for me, it's much more about the bride being something that is revelatory, the unveiling being revelation as a general concept versus a gendered concept necessarily. I'm not saying that it can never be gendered. I'm not saying there's no goodness to become of a gendered interpretation, but I do think that there's, again, kind of to touch on the secular application of it, I think it can be broadened to be more effective.
Thank you.
Time for another quick question, if we have one. Yes, Joe.
Hi, Katelynn. Thank you for a really interesting paper.
Yeah.
I suppose I wanted to push you a little bit on the relationship between end and edge, and whether by interpreting eschatology and apocalypticism as primarily edge, potentially what we lose is a an emphasis on the way in which people try to come to terms with, essentially, without wanting to put it too bluntly, things that stop. For instance, crying, or pain, or sin. So I'm wondering about this notion of cessation and what happens to the notion of cessation if really what we do is we buy into what Catherine Keller is saying about apocalypticism as edge.
I think that brings up a really good point, particularly because one other approach that I wanted to take to proposing this paper was to do a paper on the way that the interpretation of apocalypse has been interpreted by Hollywood in recent years, and how we don't see apocalypse as destruction that can't be averted or as that cessation that you're speaking to, but it's something that usually a white man stands up and says, like Armageddon, I'm gonna go drill an asteroid and save the human race, which is just, putting the power in the hands of humans to negate an end, because we aren't comfortable with the idea of end. We're not comfortable with the idea of loss or something that's beyond our control. And I think that's a very human just trait in general. But I do think that, while I think Catherine writes anthropocentrically in that sense, I do think there's also that larger kind of scientific sense that even when it comes to the cessation of one thing, there is newness until the universe dies in heat death. That it's an edge, it's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of a thing as we know it. And it may be the end of humanity's knowing, but it's not necessarily the end of all things. It might be the end of what we are able to interpret and able to conceptualize or even around to see. But the idea that we are not the be all and end all, and that these ends that we talk about might be ends within our personal stories and within our personal conceptualization of reality, but not necessarily an end on the whole. Does that make sense?
No, thank you very much. That's interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, we haven't got any more time for any more questions, I'm afraid, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much.